David Chen stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan penthouse, staring at the city lights below. In his hand was another resignation letter. He didn't even bother reading it anymore. He already knew what it would say. Something about the position not being the right fit. Something about unforeseen circumstances. Something polite that really meant his sons had driven away yet another nanny. This was number 17 in 8 months. 17 highly qualified, professionally trained caregivers. Women with decades of experience. Women who came with references from senators and celebrities. Women who arrived confident and left defeated. Some had made it a week. Most barely lasted 10 days. The longest anyone had survived was 13 days before she'd packed her bags at midnight and left without saying goodbye. David crumpled the letter and tossed it toward the trash can. It missed. He didn't pick it up. From down the hallway he heard a crash. Then silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence. The kind that made his stomach tighten with worry. He jogged toward the boys' room and found 6-year-old twin brothers standing among scattered building blocks. Ethan stared at the wall. Evan stared at the floor. Neither looked at their father. "Hey guys," David said softly, keeping his voice light. "What happened here?" Nothing, not a word. Not even a glance. He'd stopped expecting answers. His sons hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not since the accident. Not since the day their mother died when a delivery truck ran a red light and changed everything forever. The doctors called it selective mutism, trauma-induced. The therapists said it was their way of coping with grief too big for small bodies to hold. Everyone had advice. Everyone had theories. Nobody had solutions. David knelt down and started picking up the blocks. Evan moved away from him. Ethan remained frozen like a statue. After a few minutes, David gave up and left them alone. Sometimes that felt like all he could do. Leave them alone and hope that tomorrow would be different. It never was. He walked to his office and saw the message light blinking on his phone. The nanny agency. Again. He almost didn't call back. What was the point? But desperation had a way of making people do things they knew wouldn't work. "Mr. Chen," the agency director said when he returned the call. "I have one more candidate. I should tell you up front, she's not our usual type." "What does that mean?" David asked, already exhausted by the conversation. "Well, she doesn't have the traditional nanny background, no formal training from the institutes, but she raised 4 children of her own, worked with special needs kids in her community, and she specifically asked about your case when she heard the details." David rubbed his eyes. "How old is she?" 58. 58? David couldn't hide his surprise. All the previous nannies had been younger women, full of energy and modern childcare theories. "I know it's not what you're looking for, but Mr. Chen, you've been through our entire roster. This is the last person we have. Her name is Dorothy Williams. She can start Monday if you're willing to meet with her." David looked down the hallway toward his son's room. He heard nothing. That terrible, heavy silence that had filled his home for 2 years. "Fine," he said. "Send her Monday." Monday morning arrived cold and gray. David had barely slept. He'd spent most of the night thinking about the 17 nannies who had failed. What made him think number 18 would be any different? Maybe it was time to accept that his sons would never speak again. Maybe he needed to stop trying so hard to fix something that couldn't be fixed. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 in the morning. Dorothy Williams stood in the hallway wearing a simple navy blue dress and comfortable shoes. She was shorter than David expected, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back neatly. She carried an old canvas bag that looked like it had traveled 1,000 miles. When she shook his hand, her grip was firm and her eyes were clear and direct. "Mr. Chen," she said, "thank you for seeing me." "Thank you for coming," David replied, though he didn't feel thankful. He felt tired and doubtful. He showed her around the penthouse, explaining the boys' schedule, their habits, the things that upset them, the things that sometimes calmed them down. Dorothy listened without taking notes. She asked only a few questions. What do the boys like to eat? What time do they usually wake up? Do they have favorite toys or books? Simple questions. Nothing about therapy techniques or behavior management strategies. David found it almost strange. When they reached the boys' playroom, Ethan and Evan were already awake, sitting on opposite sides of the room. They didn't look up when Dorothy entered. "These are your sons?" Dorothy asked quietly. David nodded. "Ethan is wearing the red shirt. Evan is in blue. They won't respond to you. They don't speak." Dorothy stood in the doorway for a long moment just watching the boys, not studying them like the other nannies had done, with clinical observation and assessment, just watching them like a person watches the ocean or the trees, peaceful and present. "Mr. Chen," Dorothy said finally, turning to face him, "I need to tell you something before we start." Here it comes, David thought. The part where she explains her special method. The part where she promises results. The part that sounds good until it doesn't work. "I don't do reward charts," Dorothy continued. "I don't believe in timeouts or sticker systems or treating children like problems that need solving. If you want someone who's going to run this house like a business, I'm not the right person." David blinked. This wasn't what he expected. "I don't have fancy degrees," Dorothy went on. "I can't quote the latest research. What I can do is be present with your boys. I can see them as whole people, not broken things. And I can wait." "Wait for what?" David asked. "For them to be ready," Dorothy said simply. "Healing doesn't happen on our schedule, Mr. Chen. It happens on theirs." David wanted to argue. He wanted to say that he'd been waiting for 2 years and nothing had changed. He wanted to explain that patience wasn't the problem. But something in Dorothy's voice stopped him. She wasn't making promises. She wasn't selling hope. She was just stating facts the way a person states that water is wet or the sky is blue. "Can you last longer than 2 weeks?" David asked, hearing the defeat in his own voice. Dorothy smiled, a gentle expression that reached her eyes. "Mr. Chen, I've survived things that would break most people. I think I can handle 2 grieving boys and their worried father. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Trust. David had trusted 17 other people and they'd all left. But what choice did he have? "Okay," he said. "The job is yours." Dorothy nodded once, set down her canvas bag, and walked into the playroom. She didn't approach the boys. She didn't try to introduce herself or get them to acknowledge her. Instead, she pulled a wooden chair to the corner of the room, sat down, reached into her bag, and pulled out knitting needles and yarn. David watched from the doorway, confused. What was she doing? Dorothy began to knit. Her hands moved in steady, practiced rhythms, and then she started humming. Softly, an old melody that sounded like it came from another time. Ethan glanced at her once. Just once, then returned to staring at his toy car. Evan didn't look at all. Dorothy kept humming and knitting as if she had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do in the entire world. David stood there for 5 minutes, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Finally, he went to his office to start work. But every hour he checked the nanny camera on his computer. Every time he looked, Dorothy was still there. Still knitting. Still humming. Still existing in the same space as his silent sons. By lunchtime, he noticed something. The boys hadn't left the room. Usually, they wandered the penthouse, never staying in one place long. But they were both still in the playroom. By afternoon, Evan had moved closer to where Dorothy sat. Not next to her, but closer. By evening, when David came to tell Dorothy she could leave for the day, he found Ethan sitting on the floor near her chair, playing with blocks. Dorothy glanced down at him occasionally but never interrupted. Never tried to join his play, just acknowledged his presence with a small smile. "Same time tomorrow?" Dorothy asked as she packed up her knitting. David nodded, unable to find words. After she left, he sat down in the chair where she'd been sitting. It was still warm. He looked at his sons, both of them doing their own thing, both of them quiet. But something felt different. The silence didn't feel as heavy as it usually did. Maybe, David thought, just maybe, this would be different after all. Day 3 arrived quietly. Dorothy came through the door at 7 in the morning, same as before. Same navy dress, same canvas bag, same calm expression on her face. David met her in the kitchen where he was making coffee that he didn't really want but needed anyway. "How do you think it's going?" he asked, trying not to sound desperate for good news. Dorothy set her bag on the counter and looked at him directly. "Your boys are watching me." "That's good. They're deciding if I'm safe." "Safe?" David frowned. "I've never hurt them. None of the nannies hurt them. Safe isn't just about physical harm, Mr. Chen," Dorothy said gently. "It's about whether someone will try to force them to be different than they are. Whether someone will get frustrated and leave like everyone else. Whether someone will accept them as they are right now, today, not who they used to be or who we want them to become." David felt those words hit somewhere deep in his chest. How many times had he looked at his sons and wished they would just go back to normal? How many times had he tried to coax words out of them, feeling disappointed when silence was all he got back? Dorothy must have seen something on his face because she patted his arm. It's not your fault. You're their father. You want to help. But sometimes helping looks like stepping back and just being present. She picked up her bag and headed toward the playroom. David watched her go, then forced himself to walk to his office. He had meetings that morning, important calls about his company, but he found it hard to concentrate. Every few minutes he'd glance at the Nanny camera feed on his second monitor. Dorothy was in the same chair, knitting again. But today was different. Today Evan was sitting just 3 feet away from her, playing with small toy dinosaurs. He'd line them up, knock them down, line them up again. Dorothy would glance over occasionally, nod slightly, then return to her knitting. Around 9:30, something unexpected happened. Evan's dinosaur rolled across the floor and stopped right next to Dorothy's foot. The little boy froze. Dorothy saw the toy but didn't pick it up. She just kept knitting, giving Evan space to decide what to do. After what felt like forever, Evan crawled over and reached for the dinosaur. His small hand came within inches of Dorothy's shoe. She shifted her foot slightly, giving him more room. Evan grabbed the toy and scrambled back to his spot. "Good dinosaur," Dorothy said softly, not looking at him. Looked like he was trying to escape. Evan didn't respond. But he didn't leave the room either. That afternoon, David had to leave for a meeting downtown. He'd never left any of the previous nannies alone with the boys for more than an hour. They always called with problems, always needed guidance, but Dorothy had simply nodded when he told her he'd be gone for 3 hours. "We'll be fine," she'd said, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. David tried to focus during his meeting, but his mind kept drifting back to the penthouse. What were the boys doing? Was Dorothy managing okay? Should he have stayed? When he finally got home around 4 in the afternoon, he rushed through the door expecting chaos or silence or something wrong. Instead, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Music, not from a speaker or television. Someone was humming. That same melody Dorothy had been humming, but this time there were 2 voices. One deep and warm, one small and uncertain. David walked quietly to the playroom and looked inside. Dorothy sat in her usual chair, knitting. Ethan was on the floor with his blocks, and Evan stood next to Dorothy's chair looking at her knitting needles, humming along with her. The boy wasn't speaking, but he was making sound. Intentional, connected sound. David's eyes stung. He backed away before they could see him and went to his room. He sat on his bed and put his face in his hands. For the first time in 2 years, something felt like it was moving in the right direction. By the end of the first week, Dorothy had established patterns but not rules. She never demanded the boys do anything. She'd simply start an activity, and they could join or not join as they wished. In the mornings, she'd prepare breakfast while playing old jazz records on the kitchen speaker. Nothing too loud, just background music that filled the empty spaces. Sometimes Ethan would come to the kitchen and watch her cook. She'd narrate what she was doing in a gentle voice. "These eggs look happy today. Nice and yellow. I'm going to scramble them nice and soft the way my grandmother taught me." Ethan never responded, but he listened, and that felt like progress. Afternoons were what Dorothy called exploration time. She'd take the boys to the penthouse's private rooftop garden. Previous nannies had tried structured outdoor activities, nature scavenger hunts, educational games about plants, all rejected by the boys. Dorothy just opened the door and went outside. She'd find a spot in the sun, sit down and start examining leaves or watching birds. The boys would follow eventually. They'd explore on their own terms while she stayed nearby, a quiet anchor of safety. One afternoon, Evan found a ladybug on a plant. He stared at it for several minutes. Dorothy noticed but said nothing. Finally, Evan looked over at her and pointed at the bug. Dorothy came over and knelt beside him. "That's a beautiful ladybug. Look at all those spots. I wonder if she's looking for her family." Evan studied the bug more, then carefully moved the leaf so the ladybug would crawl onto a flower instead. It was such a small gesture, but it showed empathy, care, connection to living things. Dorothy caught David's eye through the window and gave him the tiniest smile. The evenings became story time, though not in any traditional way. Dorothy would sit on the floor with a picture book, but she didn't read the actual words. Instead, she'd look at the pictures and make up completely different stories. Now this book says the bear is looking for honey, she'd say, showing them a page. But I think the bear's actually looking for his favorite hat. See that look on his face? That's a, where did I put my hat look if I ever saw one. The first time she did this, David had been confused. Wasn't she supposed to teach them proper literacy? Weren't they supposed to follow the real story? But then he noticed Ethan's hand creep out and turn the page. His son wanted to see what happened next in Dorothy's made-up story. He was engaged, present, participating in his own small way. "Ah, you want to know if he finds the hat?" Dorothy said warmly. "Let's see together." That night after the boys were asleep, David found Dorothy in the kitchen preparing their lunch for the next day. She moved around the space with comfortable efficiency, cutting fruit and making sandwiches. "Can I ask you something?" David said from the doorway. "Of course, and how are you doing this?" The other nannies tried everything. Behavior charts, reward systems, therapy exercises, speech games. Nothing worked. "But you're just being here. And it's working, why?" Dorothy kept cutting apple slices, arranging them in small containers. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "Mr. Chen, did you know I lost my husband 10 years ago?" David shook his head. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Cancer. Took him in 6 months. One day we were planning our retirement, the next day we were planning his funeral." She paused, her hands still. "After he died, I didn't speak for 3 months. Not one word. People kept telling me I needed to talk about it, to express my feelings, to process my grief. But I wasn't ready. What changed?" David asked quietly. "My youngest daughter. She stopped asking me to talk. She'd just come sit with me. Sometimes we'd watch TV. Sometimes we'd sit in silence. She'd tell me about her day, not expecting responses, just sharing her life with me. And one day I had something to say, so I said it. Simple as that." Dorothy resumed cutting the apples. "Your boys aren't refusing to speak out of defiance, Mr. Chen. They're protecting themselves. Words are vulnerable things. When you speak, you open yourself up to the world. Right now, they're not ready for that vulnerability, and that's okay. But what if they're never ready?" The question David had been too afraid to ask out loud for 2 years. "Then you love them anyway," Dorothy said simply. "You love them exactly as they are. Not as who they were or who you hope they'll become, but as who they are right this moment. That's what I did with my 4 children. That's what I'm doing with your sons. I'm loving them in their silence." David felt something crack open inside him, a pressure he'd been carrying for so long that he'd forgotten it was even there. "I don't know if I'm doing that. I think I've been so focused on getting them to speak that I forgot to just be their father." Dorothy looked at him with kind eyes. "You're learning. That's what matters. And Mr. Chen, your boys know you love them. They're just waiting to feel safe enough to let that love all the way back in." That conversation stayed with David through the night and into the next day. He started watching his sons differently, not looking for signs of progress or improvement, just watching them exist. The way Ethan lined up his toy cars with such precision, the way Evan would tilt his head when he was thinking, the small uniquenesses that made them who they were. Week 2 ended. Dorothy was still there. The boys hadn't spoken, but something fundamental had shifted in the house. The silence felt less like an absence and more like a presence. A space being held for something to grow when it was ready. On Monday of week 3, Dorothy did something new. She brought out a ball of blue yarn and handed it to Evan. Just offered it to him without explanation. Evan took it, felt its texture, then looked at Dorothy with question in his eyes. "You can keep it, baby," Dorothy said, "or you can watch me turn it into something. Your choice." Evan held onto the yarn, carried it with him around the penthouse for the rest of the day, and when David checked the camera that evening, he saw his son sitting next to Dorothy's chair, holding one end of the yarn while she knitted with the other end, connected, literally and figuratively connected. David closed his laptop and walked to the playroom. He sat on the floor across from Dorothy, meeting her eyes. She smiled at him, a smile that said, "This is how it begins, not with words, with presence, with patience, with love that asks for nothing in return." Week 3 brought something David hadn't expected, routine without rigidity. Dorothy had created a rhythm to their days that felt natural, almost invisible. The boys knew what came next without needing to be told. More importantly, they seemed to trust that rhythm. Trust was something that had been missing from this house for a long time. Monday morning, Dorothy arrived with something different in her canvas bag. David watched as she pulled out a worn photo album with a cracked leather cover. She set it on the coffee table in the living room and went about her usual morning activities. Making breakfast. Playing soft music. Existing peacefully in the space, Ethan noticed the album first. He wandered over to the coffee table, stared at it, but didn't touch it. Dorothy was in the kitchen and called out without looking at him. "That's my family album, honey. You can look at it if you want. Just be gentle. Some of those pictures are older than your daddy." Ethan glanced toward the kitchen, then carefully opened the album. David watched from his office doorway, holding his breath. His son turned the pages slowly, studying each photograph. Black and white images of people from another time. Faded color photos of children and celebrations. Evan came over and sat next to his brother. Together they looked through Dorothy's history. Her wedding day. Her babies. Her husband in a military uniform. Birthday parties and holidays and ordinary moments made permanent. Dorothy came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She sat on the floor next to the boys, not taking the album but joining them in looking. "That's my Michael," she said, pointing to a tall man with a bright smile. He could fix anything. Cars, houses, broken hearts. He was good at fixing things. The boys studied the picture, and those are my babies. Well, they're not babies anymore. They're grown with babies of their own, but they'll always be my babies. She smiled at a photo of 4 children of various ages, all dressed up for what looked like Easter Sunday. Ethan's finger touched the photo gently. Then he looked up at Dorothy with a question in his eyes. She seemed to understand what he was asking without words. "You want to know if I miss them?" Dorothy asked softly. "I do, every single day. Missing people is just love with nowhere to go. So I keep that love right here." She touched her chest. "And I share it with other people who need it." Evan leaned slightly against Dorothy's arm. Just barely. Just enough to touch. She didn't make a big deal of it. Didn't pull him into a hug or comment on the breakthrough. She just let him rest there while they looked at pictures together. That afternoon, David had a video conference that ran long. By the time he finished, it was almost 4 o'clock. He went looking for Dorothy and the boys and found them in the rooftop garden. Dorothy had spread out a blanket and was showing the boys how to make flower crowns from the wildflowers that grew in the corner of the garden. Her hands moved with practiced skill, weaving stems together. Ethan watched intently. Evan was trying to copy her movements with his own handful of flowers. "You want the stems to cross like this?" Dorothy explained, demonstrating slowly, like they're holding hands. "Then you add another flower and another until you have a whole circle of flowers holding hands." It was such a simple activity, but David saw the concentration on his sons' faces. The way they were trying to create something. The way they weren't frustrated when it didn't work perfectly. Dorothy's presence made failure feel safe. "Mr. Chen," Dorothy called out when she noticed him watching. "Come join us." "These flowers need more hands," David almost said no. He had work to do. Emails to answer. But something made him walk over and sit on the blanket. Dorothy handed him some flowers without judgment or expectation. He tried to weave them together the way she'd shown the boys. He was terrible at it. Ethan looked at his father's clumsy attempt and then at his own. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "But close, so close, we're all learning," Dorothy said cheerfully. "Even grown men who run companies don't know everything." Imagine that. For the next 20 minutes, David sat with his sons and Dorothy, making terrible flower crowns, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was present in what he had. That evening, during story time, something shifted. Dorothy had the picture book open and was making up her usual creative stories. Tonight it was about a raccoon who wanted to be a chef but kept getting kicked out of restaurants. So the raccoon decided to open his own restaurant, Dorothy narrated, showing them a picture of the raccoon near some trash cans. He called it the fancy garbage and only served the finest thrown-away foods. Evan leaned forward and turned the page before Dorothy finished the sentence. Then he looked at her and pointed to the next picture. Dorothy paused. "You want to see what happens next?" Evan nodded. An actual nod. An actual response. "All right, baby. Let's see together." Dorothy's voice stayed calm, but David saw the slight tremor in her hands. This was big. This was the boys actively participating, showing preference, communicating desire. The story continued. On the next page, Evan turned it again. Then again. He was controlling the pace, making choices, showing Dorothy what he wanted. When the story ended, Evan kept his hand on the book. Dorothy waited, reading his body language. "You want another story?" she asked. Evan nodded again. So Dorothy started another story, and another, until David had to gently interrupt and remind her that it was bedtime. "Tomorrow," Dorothy promised Evan. "We'll read more tomorrow." Evan nodded once more and walked to his bedroom without protest. After the boys were settled, David found Dorothy gathering her things to leave for the evening. "That was incredible," he said. "The nodding, the participation. I haven't seen them engage like that since—" He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what he meant. "Since before, they're ready for small steps," Dorothy said. "Not big leaps. Small steps. Nodding is safer than speaking. Pointing is safer than asking. We follow their pace, not ours. How do you know when to push and when to wait?" Dorothy tilted her head, considering. "You don't push, Mr. Chen, you invite. You open doors and let them decide if they want to walk through. Pushing creates resistance. Inviting creates possibility." Over the next week, the invitations continued. Dorothy would leave art supplies out on the table and start drawing. Eventually, one or both boys would join her. She'd make cookies and ask if anyone wanted to help measure ingredients. Ethan would come over and watch, learning through observation. She started humming more often, different songs each day. Sometimes the boys would hum along. Sometimes they wouldn't. Dorothy never seemed disappointed either way. On Thursday afternoon, something happened that changed everything. David was working in his office when he heard a sound that made him freeze. Crying. One of the boys was crying. He jumped up and ran toward the sound. In the 2 years since their mother died, the boys had been silent. They'd screamed occasionally, made sounds of frustration, but they hadn't cried, not with tears and sobs and the full expression of sadness. David found Evan in the playroom, tears streaming down his face. Dorothy was kneeling in front of him, her hands on his shoulders. "I know, baby," she was saying. "I know it hurts. It's okay to cry. It's okay to feel sad." David started to rush forward, but Dorothy held up one hand, stopping him. She shook her head slightly. Let him feel this. It went against every instinct David had as a father. His son was crying. His son needed comfort, but something in Dorothy's expression made him trust her. Evan cried for several minutes, deep gulping sobs that shook his small body. Dorothy stayed close but didn't smother him. She let him feel the full weight of whatever emotion had broken through. Finally, the crying slowed. Evan wiped his face with his sleeve. Dorothy handed him a tissue. "Better?" she asked gently. Evan nodded, still hiccuping slightly. "Sometimes feelings get too big to hold inside," Dorothy said. "They need to come out." "That's healthy. That's good. Your mama would be proud of you for letting yourself feel." At the mention of their mother, Ethan looked up from where he'd been playing. His eyes were wide and uncertain. Dorothy noticed. "Your mama loved you boys more than anything in the whole world. You know that, right?" Both boys stared at her. It was the first time anyone had spoken about their mother so directly in front of them. David had been so afraid of upsetting them that he'd stopped saying her name. The therapist had advised letting the boys bring her up first. Everyone had been so careful, so cautious. Dorothy was neither. She was honest. "I never met your mama," Dorothy continued. "But I know she loved you because that's what mamas do. We love our babies even when we can't be with them anymore. That love doesn't go away just because someone dies. It stays right here." She touched her chest, then reached out and gently touched Evan's chest, then Ethan's. "It lives in you now." The room was completely still. David felt tears on his own cheeks. "My Michael died," Dorothy said quietly, "and I was so sad I thought I might die too. But then I remembered that he gave me all this love and I couldn't let it die with him, so I kept living. I kept loving. I gave that love to my children and to other people's children, and to anyone who needed it. That's what your mama would want too. She'd want you to keep living and keep loving." Ethan stood up and walked over to Dorothy. He leaned against her, his head on her shoulder. Evan was already there. Dorothy wrapped her arms around both boys and held them while they processed emotions too big for words. David watched his sons being held by this woman who'd been a stranger just 3 weeks ago. She'd done more than teach them to nod or engage with books. She'd shown them it was safe to feel, safe to hurt, safe to remember their mother without falling apart. That night after Dorothy left, David sat with his sons in their room. He pulled out his phone and showed them pictures of their mother, pictures he'd been too afraid to look at for 2 years. "This is your mom at the beach," he said, his voice shaky. She loved the ocean. And this is her holding both of you when you were babies. See how happy she looks? The boys leaned in close, studying every detail of their mother's face. Ethan touched the screen gently. Evan's breathing was uneven, like he might cry again. She loved you so much, David continued. She used to sing to you every night, and she made the best pancakes. And she always knew when you were sad, even if you didn't say anything. They looked at picture after picture, remembering, grieving, beginning to heal. When David finally tucked them into bed, Ethan grabbed his hand, held it tight, didn't let go for several seconds. It wasn't words, but it was connection, real, intentional connection. After they fell asleep, David went to his own room and called Dorothy. I just wanted to say thank you, he said when she answered, for today, for helping them feel, for talking about their mother, for everything. Mr. Chen, Dorothy said warmly, those boys are brave. Braver than most adults I know. They're doing the hard work. I'm just holding space for them to do it. You're doing more than that, David insisted. You're giving them permission to be human again. Then let me give you the same permission, Dorothy said gently. You're allowed to grieve too. You lost your wife. You're allowed to be sad and angry and confused. You don't have to be strong all the time. David felt something break loose in his chest, a dam that had been holding back 2 years of unshed tears. I don't know how to do this without her. None of us know how to do the hard things until we're doing them, Dorothy said. But you're not alone, Mr. Chen. Those boys need you. And you have me to help. We're going to figure this out together. After they hung up, David lay in bed and finally let himself cry. For his wife. For his sons. For the family they used to be and the family they were becoming. It hurt, but it also felt like breathing for the first time in years. Week 6 arrived with an unexpected challenge. David had scheduled a business dinner at the penthouse, something he'd been avoiding for months. 8 potential investors coming to discuss his company's expansion. He'd tried to cancel 3 times, but his business partner had insisted. This meeting was too important to postpone again. I can stay with the boys upstairs, David told Dorothy that morning. Keep them away from the guests. I don't want them to feel overwhelmed. Dorothy was preparing breakfast, cracking eggs into a bowl with steady hands. She stopped and looked at him. Mr. Chen, those boys live here. This is their home. Maybe instead of hiding them away, we let them be part of life. Let them see that normal things still happen, that the world keeps moving. But what if they get upset? What if having strangers here triggers something? Then we handle it, Dorothy said simply. But I think you might be surprised. They're stronger than you give them credit for. David wasn't convinced, but he'd learned to trust Dorothy's instincts. That evening, as caterers set up and guests started arriving, the boys stayed in the playroom with Dorothy. She'd told them there would be visitors, but hadn't made it seem scary or strange. Just another evening with some extra people around. The dinner started well. David moved through the social requirements on autopilot, shaking hands, making small talk, discussing profit margins and market expansion, but part of his attention was always on the hallway, listening for sounds of distress from upstairs. Around 7:30, during cocktails before dinner, Evan appeared in the living room doorway. He was wearing his favorite dinosaur shirt and holding a small plastic T-Rex. David's heart jumped into his throat. All the investors turned to look at the small boy standing there. David started to stand, ready to guide his son back to the playroom. But Dorothy appeared behind Evan, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She gave David a subtle shake of her head. Let him be. One of the investors, a woman named Patricia Chen, set down her wine glass and knelt to Evan's level. She was older, with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in an elegant twist. Hello there, Patricia said warmly. That's a very cool dinosaur shirt you have. Evan stared at her. The room went silent. David held his breath. This was the moment his son would run away or scream or shut down completely. This was why he'd wanted to keep them separate. But then Evan looked back at Dorothy. She smiled at him, an encouraging, safe smile that said, "You decide what happens next." Evan turned back to Patricia. He looked at his shirt. He looked at his dinosaur, and then his mouth opened. T-Rex, Evan whispered. The word was so soft that David almost missed it, but he didn't miss it. Nobody in that room missed it. His son had just spoken one word, one simple, beautiful word. David's vision blurred with tears. He gripped the arm of his chair to keep from falling over. The other guests looked confused, not understanding the magnitude of what had just happened. Patricia, reading the energy in the room, responded naturally. T-Rex is definitely the best dinosaur. Very powerful. From the hallway, another small voice. Velociraptor is faster. Ethan had appeared next to his brother. Both boys were now in the living room, surrounded by strangers speaking. Actually speaking, Patricia's face lit up with genuine interest. You know what? You're absolutely right. Velociraptors were incredibly fast. And they hunted in packs, which made them even more dangerous. Packs, Ethan repeated, testing the word. That's right, Patricia said, like a family. They worked together. The boys stood there processing this information. David wanted to run to them, grab them, celebrate this impossible moment. But Dorothy caught his eye and gave him that same subtle signal. Let them have this. Let it unfold naturally. Would you boys like to tell me more about dinosaurs? Patricia asked. I actually don't know very much, and you both seem like experts. Evan nodded. Ethan looked at Dorothy again, checking if this was okay. She smiled and nodded. For the next 10 minutes, the boys had a halting conversation with Patricia about dinosaurs. They spoke in short sentences, single words sometimes, but they were speaking, communicating, connecting with another human being. The other investors watched in respectful silence. David's business partner, Robert, had tears in his eyes. He'd known the boys before the accident. He remembered when they wouldn't stop talking. Eventually, Dorothy gently touched both boys' shoulders. All right, my loves. Time to let the grown-ups finish their meeting. You did such a good job sharing your dinosaur knowledge. The boys nodded and followed her back down the hallway. Before they disappeared, Evan turned and waved at Patricia. She waved back, her own eyes suspiciously bright. After they left, the room erupted in quiet conversation. Patricia turned to David. I hope that was all right, she said. I didn't mean to intrude on a family moment. David couldn't speak for a second. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotion. That was the first time my sons have spoken in 2 years. The room went silent again. 2 years? Patricia breathed. Oh my God, and they just spoke, David finished. They spoke because of Dorothy. Because she made them feel safe. Because she's been teaching us all that healing happens on their timeline, not ours. The business dinner continued, but the energy had shifted. People were quieter, more thoughtful. Patricia asked about Dorothy, about the boys, about what had happened to make them stop speaking. David found himself sharing the story of the accident, of his wife, of the 17 nannies who had failed where Dorothy succeeded. She sounds extraordinary, Patricia said. She is. David agreed. After the guests left, David went straight to the playroom. Dorothy was reading to the boys, her voice soft and steady. Both boys looked sleepy but content. Dorothy, David said from the doorway. She looked up. They spoke. They actually spoke. They did, Dorothy said with a gentle smile. They were ready. How did you know? How did you know they'd be okay with strangers here? Dorothy closed the book and stood up. I didn't know for certain, but I've been watching them get braver every day. Small brave moments. And I thought maybe they were ready for a slightly bigger brave moment. Turns out I was right. What if you'd been wrong? Then we would have learned something and tried again another day, Dorothy said. There's no failure in trying, Mr. Chen. Only information. That night, David helped tuck his sons into bed. Before he turned off the light, Ethan spoke again. Dad? His voice was quiet, uncertain. David froze. His son was talking to him. Directly to him, yes, buddy? The dinosaur lady was nice. She was very nice, David agreed, his throat tight. Will she come back? I don't know, maybe. Ethan nodded and closed his eyes. David stood in the doorway for a long time, watching his son sleep. They'd spoken today. After 2 years of silence, they'd found their voices again. Small voices, tentative voices, but voices nonetheless. Over the next week, the boys continued to speak. Not constantly. Not like they had before the accident. But here and there, words would emerge, mostly to Dorothy. Sometimes to David, always short sentences, always careful, like they were testing if words were safe to use again. Dorothy encouraged them but never demanded. She'd ask questions that could be answered with a word or two. She'd give them choices. Apple or banana? Park or garden? Simple decisions that required verbal response but didn't feel overwhelming. David found himself relearning how to talk to his own children. He'd gotten so used to their silence that hearing their voices felt almost surreal. He had to stop himself from making a big deal out of every word, from celebrating too enthusiastically and making them self-conscious. Just talk to them like normal, Dorothy advised. Like they've been talking all along. Don't make it weird. Don't make it precious. Just let it be what it is. One afternoon, David came home early and found Dorothy teaching the boys to bake cookies. The kitchen was a mess. Flour everywhere. Chocolate chips scattered across the counter. The boys had flour on their faces and in their hair. This one needs more chocolate, Evan was saying, pointing to a cookie on the baking sheet. Then add more chocolate, baby, Dorothy said, handing him the bag. Evan carefully placed 3 more chocolate chips on the cookie. Ethan was rolling dough into balls with intense concentration. Mine are bigger than Evan's, Ethan observed. That's okay, Dorothy said. Different sizes means different textures when they bake. Some people like crispy cookies, some like chewy ones. I like chewy, Evan announced. I like crispy, Ethan countered. They were having a conversation, an actual back-and-forth conversation about cookie preferences. David stood in the doorway, watching this ordinary moment that felt like a miracle. Dorothy noticed him and winked. We're making a mess, but we're making memories too. Can I help? David asked. Can Dad help? Dorothy asked the boys, making sure they had a say. Both boys nodded. Evan handed his father the chocolate chip bag. For the next hour, David baked cookies with his sons. They talked about chocolate chips and oven temperatures and whether cookies tasted better warm or cold. Simple, silly conversation about nothing important and everything important at the same time. When the cookies were done, they sat at the kitchen table and ate them while they were still warm and gooey. Chocolate smeared on small faces. Crumbs everywhere. Perfect chaos, Dorothy? Evan said suddenly. Yes, baby? Thank you for the cookies. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed steady. You're welcome, sweetheart. But you helped make them. You should be proud. Can we make more tomorrow? Ethan asked. We can make cookies anytime you want, Dorothy promised. That night, as David was leaving the kitchen, Ethan tugged on his sleeve. Dad? Yeah, buddy? I miss Mom. 3 words. 3 simple, devastating words that broke David's heart and healed it at the same time. His son was sharing his feelings, opening up, trusting that it was safe to be vulnerable. David knelt down and pulled Ethan into a hug. I miss her too. Every single day. Does it stop hurting? Ethan asked into his father's shoulder. Not really, David answered honestly, but it hurts differently. It becomes something you can carry instead of something that crushes you. Evan came over and joined the hug. 3 people holding each other in a kitchen that smelled like cookies and felt like home again. Dorothy watched from the doorway, giving them space but being present if they needed her. When David looked up and met her eyes, she smiled. A smile that said, this is healing. Messy, imperfect, but real. Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, David found Dorothy preparing to leave. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. When you first started, I thought you were just going to be another nanny who didn't last. I'd already written you off in my head. I know, Dorothy said kindly. You'd been hurt too many times to hope anymore. But you weren't just another nanny. You're not just anything. You saved my family. Dorothy shook her head firmly. No, Mr. Chen, those boys saved themselves. You saved yourself. I just held the door open while you all walked through it. That's all any of us can do for each other. Hold doors and wait. She gathered her bag and headed toward the elevator. Before she left, she turned back. Those boys are going to be just fine. Better than fine. They're going to be extraordinary, because they've already survived the hardest thing most people ever face, and they came out the other side still able to love. That's strength, Mr. Chen. Real strength. The elevator doors closed and David stood alone in his penthouse, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of possibility. 3 months after Dorothy started working with the Chen family, spring arrived in New York City. The rooftop garden burst into color with flowers the boys had helped plant. Cherry blossoms lined the streets below. Everything felt new and alive. The boys were speaking regularly now, though they still had quiet days. Days when words felt too heavy and silence felt safer. Dorothy never pushed on those days. She'd simply exist alongside them, humming her songs and being present. The boys had learned that silence was okay, that they could move between speaking and not speaking without judgment. David had changed too. He'd started therapy himself, something he'd resisted for 2 years. Talking to someone about his grief, His fears, his guilt over not being able to help his son sooner. He'd learned that he'd been carrying his own silence, his own inability to express the weight of losing his wife. One Saturday morning, Dorothy arrived to find David making pancakes. The boys were still asleep. "You're here early," Dorothy said with surprise. "I wanted to talk to you about something," David said, flipping a pancake with questionable skill. "The boys' school called. They want them to start attending in the fall. Not full-time at first, just a few hours a day to ease back in." Dorothy nodded, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "And how do you feel about that?" "Terrified," David admitted. "What if the other kids make fun of them? What if they stop talking again? What if I'm pushing them too fast? What if they're ready?" Dorothy countered gently. "What if they thrive? What if being around other children helps them keep growing?" David set down the spatula and sat across from her. "How do I know what's right?" "You don't," Dorothy said honestly. "Nobody knows for certain. But you know your boys now. You've watched them get braver. You've seen them reach for words when they're ready. So you make the best decision you can with the information you have, and you trust that they'll tell you if it's too much. Will you be here when they start school? Will you still come every day?" Dorothy smiled. "Mr. Chen, I'll be here as long as you need me. But eventually you're going to realize you don't need me anymore. You and those boys are going to be just fine on your own." "I don't think that's true," David said quietly. "I don't think we'll ever not need you." Dorothy reached across the table and patted his hand. "Then let me rephrase. You won't need me the same way. The job will change. But I'm not going anywhere unless you want me to." That afternoon, David sat down with his sons in the rooftop garden. They were examining a new type of butterfly that had appeared that morning. Evan was trying to count its spots. Ethan was sketching it in a notebook Dorothy had given him. "Hey guys, I want to talk to you about something," David began. Both boys looked up, immediately attentive. They'd learned that when adults used that tone, something important was coming. "Your school called. They want to know if you'd like to start going back in the fall. Not every day at first, just a little bit. To see your old friends and make new ones." Silence. The boys looked at each other, having one of those wordless conversations that twins sometimes have. "What about Dorothy?" Evan asked finally. "Dorothy will still be here. She'll pick you up from school and be here every afternoon just like always." "What if we don't want to talk at school?" Ethan asked, his voice small. David had been prepared for this question. Dorothy had helped him think through possible responses. "Then you don't have to," David said. "You can talk when you're ready. And if you're not ready, that's okay too. The school knows about what happened to Mom. They know you might have quiet days. They're going to help you, not pressure you." "Will the other kids be nice?" Evan asked. "Most of them will be," David answered honestly. "Some might not understand. Some might ask questions. But you'll have teachers there who will help you. And you'll have each other." The boys considered this. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Can we try? And if we don't like it, can we stop?" "Absolutely," David promised. "We can try and see how it feels. You're in charge of this decision." "Okay," Ethan said. "Okay," Evan echoed. It was decided, just like that. The boys would go back to school. Another step forward into a life that was starting to feel normal again, even though it would never be the same as before. Summer arrived with hot days and thunderstorms. Dorothy took the boys to museums and parks. They went to the zoo and spent an entire day at the aquarium. The boys asked questions constantly now, their curiosity returning along with their voices. They wanted to know how things worked, why things happened, what made the world turn. David found himself answering questions about his work, about his childhood, about their mother. The boys asked about her more often now. What was her favorite color? What songs did she like? Did she prefer chocolate or vanilla ice cream?